Greetings, friends of liberty. As a child, I was of course brought up in the Anglican Church, and one of the functions of their priests, or shrivers, was to hear confession and then assign penance for absolution, this process naturally being called shriving. Now it happened one Sunday that, when I was about 8, my mother urging me to attend confession, I reluctantly entered the confessional pew, but told the shriver my uncertainty as to whether I actually had anything to confess. He asked what I meant, and so I told him the following story. When playing 6 months prior with the children in my neighborhood, the sister of one of the younger neighborhood children, a veritable hoyden, had aggressively challenged me, betting me a crown, which is 5 shillings, that she could beat me in a fight. When naturally I told her I don't fight girls, she challenged me to fight her younger brother, who was slightly smaller than I, and who himself agreed. After a brief scuffle, in which hardly a punch was thrown, I simply pushing him around a bit, and it being clear that I had won the fight, and he wouldn't offer much resistance, I went home. She quite obstinately, over the next few weeks, refused to pay the crown, and so I resolved to go directly to her parents, instead the source of her allowance. One afternoon, I knocked on their door, and when her mother appeared, I unfortunately didn't explain the entirety of the circumstances, but simply said that I'd beaten up her son for a bet, and her daughter, who had arranged the challenge, refusing to pay, I was owed a crown. To my astonishment, the mother became outraged, called her daughter, brought me in the house, gave me a scolding in view of her husband, who quietly read the newspaper during the entire proceedings, and then shooed me away. Out the door, she too refusing to retire her family debt. And so I, being perplexed, I then asked my priest or shriver, given the mother's response, what, if anything, I had done wrong. He thought for a moment and said, "My son, since you are not the aggressor in the fight, and since no permanent harm was received by either party, the Lord cannot find fault in this respect. However," he added, "to not know that a mother would react this way to the news of her son's battle and his pugilistic defeat does betoken a small sin of ignorance, and thus your penance is to reflect for 5 minutes daily, for a week, on what I've said here. Can you promise me that?" I promised him and did reflect for 5 minutes for a week, and I must say that over the subsequent years I've found his counsel that the sin was in not foreseeing the mother's reaction wise and insightful. However, when we think of wise and insightful shrivers of today, in your 21st century, one of the most famous is Lionel Shriver, an American writer and novelist now living in London and famous for, among other works, We Need to Talk About Kevin. Lionel was just recently on Planet Normal, a delightful podcast hosted by UK economist Liam Halligan and well-known Telegraph columnist Alison Pearson. And as I was listening to their latest, entitled Lord Frost and Lionel Shriver on Braverman, Budgets and Brexit, in order to catch up what is happening in my own country 230 years later, I was astonished to hear the following remarks, starting at the 1 hour, 2 minute and 35 second mark. Lionel Shriver. The hard left are in positions of power and have a huge amount of control over institutions in both the UK and US. It's Western-wide. In fact, the Anglosphere. Liam Halligan. How'd that happen? Why don't we stop it? Lionel Shriver. I do not know. These people are not capable of coordinated conspiracy, but it has something to do with the fact that these people are the products of universities, and this stuff started in universities, and that's the only explanation I've got. Now, as I reclined in my bed, dozing, upon hearing these remarks, my eyes started wide open, and I thought to myself, If only I might tell Lionel. Then she'd have that final piece of the puzzle as to why what's happening to the U.S. and the West is happening. And that knowledge would be, of course, extraordinarily valuable to her. And since she's a well-known political commentator and might relate that knowledge to others, to us all. Excuse me. And so if I succeed in using the TARDIS to go forward in time and to talk with Lionel about her puzzlement, here's how I imagine the conversation would proceed. Myself. Lionel, I heard your recent comments on Planet Normal about wokeness starting in universities, and I don't know the reason why that happened. Would you like me to explain it? Lionel. Yes, I certainly would. Myself. So the first thing to do is not to focus on wokeness per se in contemporary culture, but to step back in time to look at history and other historical ideologies that have become dominant through the ages. Would you please, in your opinion, name some of these other dominant ideologies for me? Lionel. Sure, I'd say Christianity, Islam, communism, fascism. Myself. Perfect. And what do we know about how these ideologies became dominant? Lionel. Well, most were at some point pretty violent. Myself. Exactly. Christianity from 380 AD on, when it became a state religion, with all its subsequent inquisitions. Islam through its entire brutal existence of conquest and subservient status for conquered dhimmi populations. And communism and fascism with their gulags and concentration camps. Lionel. So what does that mean? Myself. It means that any time we see a dominant ideology in a country, the first thing we should ask is, was violence or state force used to privilege its rise? Lionel. But then how exactly did that happen with wokeness in America? Myself. In the following way. So, for example, the values of us, the people, are not generally woke. So if you see woke institutions, it means those institutions were disconnected from us and our values. And how did that happen? It happened through the fact that our tax dollars were and are taken through state force to support both state universities directly and private universities with their tax exemptions on capital gains and property taxes, as well as, in addition, through the huge amounts of federal funding, again taken from us, the taxpayer, that goes to institutions through their students who get student aid from the government, and also through the funding for scientific and federal research. And all that money is now only given to colleges after it's taken from us if they abide by Title 7 and 9 of the Civil Rights Acts, which, being racist and sexist, Americans don't generally support. Lionel. But why has it happened so much now and not earlier? Myself. It's intensifying now, firstly, because college universities never before had to follow the racist and sexist mandates of Title 7 and 9 of the Civil Rights Acts, which were enacted in 1964 and 1991. And in addition, because of the 1978 Supreme Court ruling of the Regents of the University of California versus Bakke, which allowed colleges already liberal to be racist and sexist as long as they could plausibly use the excuse of diversity to do so. And also, in addition, because the Civil Rights Act of 1991 resulted in many more and more severe penalties for violating Title 7 and 9. So all these elements of state coercion together, first creating liberal institutions whose graduates in the 60s were the legislators who drafted and passed Title 7 and 9, and judges who enacted Supreme Court rulings, are creating a more and more intense effect, a perfect storm of wokeness. First, state force was used to produce the ideology of morals legislation, and then the laws. Lionel. Aha! So it's essentially a state-created, privileged, and enforced ideology. Myself. Exactly, Lionel. And so when, for example, Ibram Kendi says that whites are privileged in the U.S., the reality is very different in that it is actually racist liberals like himself who are riding on the coattails of a state-funded and created ideology created over the last half century and who rake in huge amounts of money and popularity that they'd never get otherwise. And this has happened ever since the 60s and 70s when thousands of PC and woke departments in the intellectual garbage that Kendi teaches, like white, black, fat, indigenous, queer, feminist, and multicultural studies, were created with huge amounts of governmental funding. These woke departments would never have been created in a purely private higher educational system, but only in one, excuse me, which again gets huge amounts of funding from the state. Because being racist and sexist is not productive in a free society, it wouldn't make colleges any money. But in the present system of governmental education, with its billion-dollar diversity consultancies and programs getting federal aid, it makes lots of money. Lionel. Wow, that blows my mind. Myself. I knew you'd understand. I suspected that as a libertarian, you'd see the truth of what I was saying very quickly. And so that, my dear listeners, is how I imagine my conversation with Lionel shall go. On that note of optimism, I bid you well and remain as ever the Scarlet Pimpernel.